Hello, my name is Jeffrey Catalano, and this is my final project presentation. My presentation is on the writer-director Paul Schrader and what I and many others consider to be his most important films. So I chose to do my final project on Paul Schrader because he is a screenwriting idol of mine. I chose to do my project in essay form because I felt it was the best way to convey my thesis. So the quote on the screen is one from Taxi Driver, which is Paul Schrader's most well-known film by far. So Schrader's Man in a Room and God's Only Man films, as they're called, are basically one and the same and feature the same kind of archetype. And I will explain this more later. So my project heavily favors the auteur theory, which asserts that the director is the main author of a film. And in Schrader's case, he writes many of the films he directs, because he started as a screenwriter. So my thesis goes something like this. Schrader's Man in a Room and his God's Only Man films offer a masterclass in subjective point of view, and they are undoubtedly his most personal works. So, Schrader's childhood. He was born in 1946 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up in a strict religious household. His family was Calvinist. He did not see his first film until he was well into his teens, and that was the Elvis Presley film Wild in the Country. So when he came of age, Schrader went to Calvin University, a Calvinist college, at first, and he had plans to be a minister. But then his interest in film grew exponential, and he decided to start taking classes at Columbia. And then he got into the UCLA film program, and that's where he became obsessed with European art house cinema and the likes of French filmmaker Robert Bresson. And before he graduated, he wrote a book of film theory called Transcendental Style in Film. He wrote this when he was 24 years old. So after his time at UCLA, Schrader worked as a film critic. And he worked as a film critic like the woman who helped him get into UCLA, Pauline Kael, who is pictured on the left. Schrader's stint as a film critic was short-lived, though. The first script he wrote was with his brother Leonard. It was called The Yakuza. It was not a very successful film. It was Schrader's second produced screenplay, the one for Taxi Driver, that put his name on the map and sealed his name in movie history. So Schrader wrote Taxi Driver in about 10 or 15 days, which is hard to believe considering how seminal the film is. But he wrote it at a very low point in his life, when he was an alcoholic, an insomniac, and frequenting porn theaters. He actually ended up in the hospital with an ulcer at this low point in his life, and that's where he envisioned the metaphor for Taxi Driver of an isolated man in a yellow cab. So Schrader worked with Martin Scorsese, the director of Taxi Driver, 3 more times after the film came out. Schrader's first 2 films as a filmmaker and director were Blue Collar and Hardcore. In both films, Schrader's still kind of trying to find his voice, but they're both pretty good and well worth a watch. So in 1980, Schrader came out with American Gigolo, which was the first Man in a Room film that he himself directed. And it's about a vain, egotistical, high-end escort who, despite his wealth and good looks, is lonely and unhappy with his life. So 12 years after the success of American Gigolo, one of Paul Schrader's most successful films, he made Light Sleeper, which is about a drug dealer in his 40s who feels out of place because he doesn't know what else to do with his life. He feels very lost. The film is about as bleak as Taxi Driver, and it's one of Schrader's best. Light Sleeper was officially the end of the Man in the Room saga, but that saga took on a new form with 2017's First Reformed. This film is about a lonely pastor, and you're pulled into that pastor's world, much like you are in Taxi Driver. After the release of First Reformed, which was a critical success, Schrader made The Card Counter in 2021, which is about a man with a very dark and vicious past. In 2022, Schrader wrapped up his God's Only Man trilogy with Master Gardener, which is again about a man with a dark past. So Schrader's Man in a Room films are largely autobiographical, and they capture Schrader at different periods of his life. In Taxi Driver, when Schrader was in his 20s, he was lonely and so isolated, and he didn't know what he was going to do with his life. In 1980, with American Gigolo, Schrader was firmly in the Hollywood world. And then with Light Sleeper in 1992, Schrader was well into his career, but he'd had a number of duds behind him, and he didn't really know what was going to become of his career. So Schrader's God's Only Man trilogy is much more spiritual in tone than his Man in a Room films, and they were Schrader's personal attempt to prove his own film theory, which he wrote about in Transcendental Style in Film. So Schrader and empathy. So Schrader is, as a screenwriter, will probably always best be known for how he makes you empathize with some of the most evil or terrible characters in film. For instance, Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver is a killer. Julian Kay of American Gigolo is totally self-obsessed and narcissistic. Jean Latour of Light Sleeper is pretty much a loser. And William Tell of The Card Counter committed human atrocities in his past. So Schrader's filmography is incredibly extensive, but he will most be remembered for his Man in a Room and God's Only Man films. Here are my sources. Thanks.